The horses didn't make a sound, not at first. But then came the drums, slow, steady, like thunder from a sky that hadn't yet cracked. By the time Thaddeus Bear Mallister opened the door to his cabin, 200 Comanche warriors had already lined up outside his barn, not in chaos, but in eerie, perfect silence. Spears pointed, faces painted, eyes fixed, the kind of silence that comes before a storm or a slaughter. This wasn't a visit, it was a reckoning. Bear stood in the doorway with no rifle in his hands, only the girl by his side. Barefoot, no heavier than a sack of grain, wrapped in his old wool blanket and shaking not from the cold but from the memory of what came before. She was Comanche. And if Bear was right, she wasn't just any child. She was the daughter of the one man who could end a town with a single nod. Chief White Bull. How did it come to this? How did a lone cowboy become the hinge between peace and war, life and death, between two worlds that had never spoken with anything but blood? It started 24 hours ago, under the sun that never gave mercy in a stretch of land between Amarillo and nowhere. Bear was mending his fence when he saw her, a silhouette, stumbling through the tall grass like a wounded ghost. Her steps were uneven, her clothes torn from the wind, not running, not playing, just surviving. And right then, Bear knew that child was either his salvation or his grave. Bear wasn't the kind of man to second-guess instinct. Years on the frontier had trained him to smell danger like smoke on the wind. But what he saw that morning didn't look like danger. It looked like desperation wrapped in a child's bones. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her braids were coming undone, her cheeks sunken. Traditional Comanche garments clung to her frame like rags, flapping in the dry wind. She moved in zigzags toward the creek, each step a silent plea. Even from 50 yards, Bear could see the hunger, a hunger that didn't ask permission, that didn't wait for dignity. He set down his hammer and walked. No rifle, no shouting, just slow steps, hands open, like approaching a wild animal that might bolt or bite. When he reached her, she stopped, looked up. Her dark eyes were too big for her face, and they held the weight of someone who'd already lost too much to be afraid anymore. Her lips moved quickly in Comanche words Bear didn't understand, but he didn't need to. She pointed to her mouth, then to the water. Hunger and thirst, the language of survival. Bear hesitated. He thought about the town, about how a single settler helping a Comanche child could light a fuse no one could put out. He thought about what folks like Cletus Hartwell would say, about the stories of raids and retaliations, about how mercy in these parts could be mistaken for betrayal. But then he looked at her again, and chose the road few would. He lifted her gently. She weighed less than a sack of oats and carried her toward his cabin. She didn't flinch, didn't resist. Her body was a trembling reed in a storm, too weak to fear the hand that held her. Inside the one-room cabin, Bear laid her in his only chair. She slumped like a doll forgotten on a porch step. He moved quickly, pouring stew from the pot he'd left, simmering and slicing up what little bread remained from the morning. The moment the scent reached her, her body twitched, like life was reminding itself it had something to live for. As she reached out, something glinted beneath her collar, a thin band of beaded leather, colors woven in ceremonial precision. Bear froze mid-motion. He knew that pattern. Old Pete Morrison, just last week, had warned him. If you ever see beads like these, walk away. They belong to Chief White Bull's bloodline, no exceptions. And now that beadwork sat in his home across from him around the neck of a starving child who was eating his stew. He was no longer helping a child. He was harboring the daughter of the most feared Comanche chief in Texas. Bear's hand trembled slightly as he handed over the bowl. She took it without question and began eating with quiet ferocity, spoon shaking, broth spilling down her chin, but never stopping. Every bite was survival, every chew was defiance against death. He watched her, heart pounding. A dozen thoughts raced through his mind, but all of them crashed into the same wall. It was too late to undo what he'd done. 20 miles away, riders were already scanning the prairie, and one of them was her father. By late afternoon, Bear sat by the window, his rifle untouched on the wall. The girl had fallen asleep, curled up beneath his blanket like a coyote pup, tucked into the safety of a den. Her face, still too pale, had softened into something almost peaceful. But peace in the West never lasted. Hoofbeats kicked up a warning long before voices followed. 3 riders approached at full gallop. Cletus Hartwell, red-faced and cursing before he even dismounted. Deputy Jake Morrison, eyes tight with unease. And Reverend Thomas, clutching his Bible like it might deflect bullets. Bear stepped outside before they could tie up their reins. "What in God's name have you done, Bear?" Cletus spat, dismounting. "You trying to get us all killed?" "I gave food to a hungry girl," Bear answered, low and steady. "That girl is White Bull's kin," Morrison said, already backing toward his saddle. "You didn't just feed her. You might have kidnapped her in their eyes." Reverend Thomas said nothing at first. He looked past Bear toward the window, then lowered his voice. "She's inside?" Bear nodded. The silence that followed was heavier than steel. "They'll come," Morrison said, his words flat. "You know that, right? Not with questions, with war paint." "I didn't take her," Bear muttered. "She came to my creek, alone." "Doesn't matter," Cletus snapped. "You're the white man who touched what wasn't his. That's all they'll need to know." Deputy Morrison sighed. "I have to report this, but I'll give you a head start. Try to return her tonight, before they get here." "And what if I don't find them?" Bear asked. "What if they find me first? That's your problem now." And just like that, they rode off into the dusk, leaving Bear standing alone in the twilight, a child asleep inside, and a reckoning galloping closer with every heartbeat. The sun dropped fast, like a guillotine in the sky. And then the drums began, not loud, not fast, but deliberate. The drums started as a whisper on the wind, a low pulse that seemed to rise from the ground itself, like the heartbeat of the earth remembering its rage. Bear froze at the sound, breath held. He moved to the window and parted the curtain. Nothing. Just night and prairie. But the girl had heard it too. She stirred in the chair, eyes flying open. She sat upright, then bolted to the door and pointed outside, speaking in frantic Comanche. She held up her hands, fingers opening and closing, counting 10, 20, 50, more. She kept going. By the time she reached 200, Bear's legs had turned to water. He moved fast, not to run, but to think. Should he saddle his horse, take her and ride? But where? And would he even make it a mile before an arrow struck his spine? The drums grew louder, slower, rhythmic. Not the fury of a raiding party, this was ceremony. Deliberate. It wasn't chaos approaching, it was judgment. The girl clutched his sleeve, then made a slicing motion across her throat. Her eyes begged him not to open that door. Outside, shapes began to emerge. Not fast, not charging, just forming. They came like smoke, given form warriors on horseback, draped in feathers and silence. Their formation was flawless. A wide half circle tightening like a noose. No torches, no yelling, just 200 mounted warriors and the cold precision of justice. A voice finally broke the stillness, deep, commanding, and sharp as flint. "White man, we know what you've done. Send out the child, or lose the dawn." Bear's mouth was sand. The voice carried weight. Authority. It could only be one man, Chief White Bull. But before Bear could respond, the girl grabbed his arm and shook her head violently. She pointed to herself, then made a gesture Bear had seen once years ago, at a funeral. She wasn't warning him of danger, she was warning him of what her death would mean. A child like her, a chief's only daughter, wasn't just bloodline. She was legacy, culture, future. If she died in his care, whether by mistake or mercy, it would demand more than revenge. It would demand fire. Bear realized, with a jolt saving her, had only been step one. Now he had to prove it. And he had about 30 seconds to figure out how. Bear opened the door with both hands raised high. The girl stood beside him, small and shivering, her blanket fluttering like a white flag in the moonlight. She hesitated only a moment, then stepped forward. The warriors didn't move. They didn't have to. Their stillness was more terrifying than any war cry. At the front of the formation sat a man whose presence could silence thunder. Broad-shouldered, hair streaked with silver, eyes like storm clouds, with memory Chief White Bull. When the girl cried out, sprinting toward him, Bear felt a sliver of hope pierce the dread. A father reunited with his child, surely that meant relief, gratitude. But White Bull's expression darkened. He dismounted in one smooth motion and dropped to his knees, inspecting her like a soldier assessing the wounded. She spoke rapidly, gesturing to Bear, to the cabin, to the hills beyond. Bear couldn't understand a word, but he didn't need a translation. Her story was being told, and whatever it wasn't fixing anything. White Bull stood, walked forward, every step deliberate. "My daughter says you fed her," he said in low, perfect English. "She says you gave her shelter." Bear nodded. "She would have died otherwise." "She says you saw her beads," White Bull added, voice cold. "And you still did not return her." I I was going to, in the morning. She was too weak." "Perhaps," the chief said, "or perhaps you wished to keep her, trade her, or worse." Behind him, 200 warriors tensed. Hands rested on bows, fingers brushed against triggers of old rifles. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of decision. Bear's mouth moved, but no words came. What could he say? That he had nothing to gain? That he'd acted from mercy in a land where mercy was often mistaken for weakness? Then, with a sudden clarity, he remembered something, a scrap of fabric he'd found caught in his fence, the same color and stitching as the beads on her neck. He reached into his coat. Every bow was drawn in an instant. "Wait!" Bear called out, lifting only the fabric. "She was wearing this when I found her. I kept it. I didn't touch her. I didn't harm her. She came to me." White Bull stepped forward, taking the fabric. His eyes flickered. Recognition. "She came to my water. I gave her stew, my last bread, my only blanket. I asked for nothing." Behind them, the girl tugged her father's arm, pointing to the cabin. She beckoned to him with both hands, pulling at his sleeve like a child asking to show a secret. White Bull hesitated, then gestured for Bear to follow. Together, the three stepped inside the cabin. It was a simple place, wood walls, a single chair, a cold stove. But to the girl, it had been a sanctuary. She pointed to the bowl on the table, now empty but still stained with stew. Then to the chair she'd slept in. Then to the folded blanket Bear had used to cover her. She mimed the motions, eating, sleeping, warmth. Then she pointed to Bear and smiled. It was the first true smile she'd shown all night. White Bull said nothing, his gaze scanning the cabin. His eyes landed on a small photo resting on the mantel, a tintype, faded with time. It showed a woman and child, pale-skinned, smiling. "My wife and son," Bear said quietly. "Gone 3 winters now. Cholera." The chief stared at the image, something shifting in his face, not weakness, but memory. "You have lost children too," he said. Bear nodded once. "My boy was her age." Outside, The warriors remained still. But something in the air had changed. The girl spoke softly to her father, pointing again at the photograph. She says, White Bull translated, she saw sorrow in your eyes, the kind that knows what it means to lose someone too young. She believes you helped her, not because she was Comanche or valuable, but because you remembered what it felt like to be helpless. Bear said nothing. He couldn't. His throat burned. White Bull stood in silence. Then he turned and walked outside. Bear followed. The warriors watched their chief, waiting for the signal. Behind him, Broken Arrow, the younger, blood-hungry warrior with a scar running across his cheek, rode forward. He dismounted and shouted something in Comanche, pointing his lance at Bear. White Bull responded, calm but firm. But Broken Arrow stepped closer. His lance nearly touched the chief's chest now. Bear didn't understand the words, but he understood the stakes. Blood demanded blood, and mercy looked like weakness. Before anyone could speak again, the girl stepped between them. She looked up at Broken Arrow, fierce, unshaken, and began to speak. Her voice, high and young, cut through the night like a bell in fog. She spoke in Comanche, fast and unwavering, eyes moving from one warrior to another, her small hand gesturing, imploring. White Bull translated softly beside Bear. She is telling them what happened, how she got lost in the storm, how she walked for days, how she thought she would die alone until she saw the fence, until a man lifted her up and gave her food and warmth and silence to sleep in. The warriors leaned in, listening. Even those behind Broken Arrow. She is telling them, the chief continued, that you asked for nothing, that you offered safety when you could have claimed ransom, that you gave comfort when others might have reached for their rifle. Broken Arrow's grip on his lance loosened slightly. She asks him now. White Bull murmured, astonishment in his voice, if he has children. The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. She asks what he would hope for if his son was lost, hungry, alone, and stumbled onto the land of strangers. Would he want that child shot or saved? Broken Arrow didn't answer. His lips moved, barely. Then the lance lowered. But the girl wasn't done. She turned to the rest of the warriors, speaking with growing strength. Her hands waved in rhythm with her voice, her small frame casting a long shadow under the moon. She says, White Bull whispered, if we punish kindness, we become no better than those who slaughter without cause. That to call for blood tonight would be to make monsters of ourselves. That the white man did not act like a soldier, he acted like a father. A hush fell over the clearing. For a full minute, no one moved. Then Broken Arrow spoke quieter, softer, his eyes on Bear. He says, White Bull translated, perhaps the spirit sent him not an enemy, but a teacher. The tension broke like the wind shifting after a long drought, subtle but unmistakable. White Bull turned to Bear, eyes no longer burning, but clear with something more dangerous than anger. Expectation. My daughter has done something rare, he said. She turned a war party into a council. Bear waited, but now comes the hardest part. What's that? He asked, throat dry. You must stand before those who have hated your kind their whole lives and convince them she was right to trust you. He gestured toward his horse. Come. The girl reached for Bear's hand as he mounted behind White Bull. She rode with another warrior, her smile faint but unshaken. They rode through the night, deeper into land Bear had never seen, canyons hidden from maps, trails worn only by those who belonged. The sky stretched wide above them, stars wheeling like silent witnesses. Not one word was spoken. As dawn threatened the edge of the world, they arrived. The Comanche village rose like a mirage, a circle of fires, smoke hurling into morning. Elders sat by the central flame, their faces carved from time and grief. Bear had never felt smaller. He stood alone in the circle, surrounded by a people who had every reason to hate him. White Bull spoke first, laying out the facts: the girl's disappearance, the storm, the hunger, the discovery. Then Broken Arrow stepped forward, his voice steady, but his eyes uncertain. He argued for tradition, justice, fear. The crowd murmured. Old wounds opened. Then the girl stepped into the firelight. She spoke slowly, with a quiet certainty Bear hadn't seen in her before. Her voice floated above the crackle of flames and into the marrow of those listening. She spoke of fear and mercy, of being lifted, not hunted, of bread and blankets, of a photograph of a dead family and the sadness behind the cowboy's eyes. When she finished, an old man with snow-white hair asked her one question. She answered with a single word, yes. The old man stood slowly, joints creaking like dry wood, and stepped forward. His voice was cracked and low, but each syllable carried like thunder across the circle. White Bull translated, he says, the Spirit sent us a test not of war but of wisdom. That tonight we face the question of whether mercy could be answered with mercy. Bear felt the weight in his chest loosen, but he didn't dare breathe. You will be allowed to return to your land unharmed, the elder continued. But more than that, you will be protected. Any Comanche who harms you or your cattle or your soil will answer to this fire. Bear's lips parted, but no words came. There is one condition, the elder said. Bear nodded. Anything. If any of our people, man, woman, child, come to you hungry or lost or wounded, you will treat them as you treated her. I swear it, Bear said, on the grave of my son. The elder stepped back. And then something no one expected happened. The girl, the same one who, a day earlier, had stumbled across a field near death, ran to Bear and wrapped her arms around him. Then, in halting English, she whispered into the silence, "Thank you for saving me. Now I save you." The circle around them rippled, not with speech, but with stillness, respect. As the sun broke over the eastern ridge, Bear rode back through Comanche lands not as a prisoner but as a guest. White Bull rode beside him, the girl trailing just behind, her shoulders straighter than they had ever been. When they reached Bear's barn, the warriors peeled away, one by one, fading back into the brush like ghosts returning to legend. But one rider remained a tall figure with silver hair and quiet eyes. White Bull nodded once. Your ranch is a bridge now, he said, between fire and water. Bear didn't understand the full meaning, but in time he would. Weeks passed, then seasons, and still the child returned. Each year, on the same day, the day Bear opened his door to a starving stranger, she came back, first with her father, then alone, then in time with others, not to ask for food, but to share it. They would sit on his porch and eat in silence, then in stories, then in laughter. The girl grew into a woman tall, composed, fluent in English and Comanche both. She became a bridge between two worlds, translating not only words but wounds. Where others saw enemies, she spoke of neighbors. Where others feared, she remembered the stew, the chair, the photograph of a family lost. And Bear, he never left. He didn't become rich, didn't gain fame, but his land, once a lonely outpost between Amarillo and nowhere, became something else, a neutral ground. Settlers and Comanche alike came to trade, to talk, to rest. Fences turned into markers of peace, not borders of fear. The local preacher, Reverend Thomas, would one day say, "That ranch saw more miracles than my pulpit ever did." Cletus, once red with fear, brought his injured nephew to Bear after a hunting accident. The wound was stitched by a Comanche healer. The boy lived. Deputy Morrison returned with a quiet apology. He never said the words, but Bear saw them in his eyes. As for Broken Arrow, he visited once, just once. He did not speak. But he stood by the fire and nodded toward Bear. That was enough. And the girl, now a woman, became something greater than a name. She carried no weapons, only stories. Stories that softened hearts and disarmed grudges. Stories of a man who chose kindness when war was easier. In his final years, Bear walked with a limp and planted sunflowers by the fence where the girl once appeared. He said they reminded him that mercy, like seeds, needed only soil and time. When he died at 73, half the village came to his funeral. Settlers wept beside warriors. And in the silence after the sermon, one woman stood and whispered, "He was the first man who didn't see me as the enemy." There are moments in life, quiet, fleeting, that split the world in two. Before and after, for Thaddeus Bear Mallister, that moment came not with a gunfight or a duel at high noon, but with the trembling hand of a starving child and the decision to open his door. What he couldn't have known, what no man can see in the moment, is how far that single act would echo. He didn't set out to make peace. He didn't aim to change hearts. He simply chose compassion in a land ruled by suspicion, chose mercy where history demanded vengeance, chose to feed a child who wasn't his, and never asked why she came alone. And in doing so, he reminded two broken cultures separated by war and grief that mercy isn't weakness, it's resistance. It's defiance in the face of the stories we've been told about enemies, about borders, about blood. It takes courage to fight, but it takes a different kind of courage to sit, to listen, to feed a stranger instead of fearing one. Bear didn't speak many words in his life, but the ones he lived became legend. A rancher without fame, without riches, who died with sunflowers at his gate, and both settler and Comanche hands lowering him into the soil. And the girl, now grown, now whole, carried his story into every village, every town, every firelight circle where mistrust still lingered like old smoke. "This man," she would say, "saw me as a child, not a threat, not a pawn, just a child." And because of that one choice, the drums that once beat for war now beat for memory. And the next time a settler saw a shadow on the prairie, he waited just a moment longer before reaching for his gun.